Hello, curious people. I'm delighted to have you back again for another episode of Curious People Wanted, a series in which we explore the fascinating artifacts of the Barnum Museum's collection. My name is Adrienne Saint-Pierre, and I'm the curator at the Barnum Museum in Bridgeport, Connecticut. If you've been watching our other recent Curious People episodes, you know that I've introduced some great new material that the museum recently received. When I say new, I mean new to the museum. And so far, I've always focused on things that in some way are connected to P.T. Barnum or the people he made famous. But in this episode, I'm going to show you some items that have been here for a very long time, in one case over 100 years, when this was the Barnum Institute of Science and History. And although these items date from P.T. Barnum's lifetime, there isn't actually a direct connection to him. Now, the star of the show here today is one of my absolute favorite items in the collection, and I've also pulled a couple of other items as well. All of these are among a small but really fascinating collection of Civil War artifacts that we have. And most of these things were either given by the veterans themselves or their widows or their direct descendants. So in other words, they haven't changed hands outside the families over the years, and that means we know they are authentic and who they belong to. This doesn't look so glamorous as an object, but what a story this has. This is an extremely rare and genuinely unique, that is truly one of a kind, newspaper made by a Connecticut soldier named Captain William H. May. And it was made in a prisoner of war camp and secretly brought home with two other papers by Captain May when he was exchanged after 13 months in prison. So to did this newspaper come to be? Well, it was born out of one man's creative spirit and sheer determination to raise the spirits of his fellow soldiers in this Confederate prison camp. Captain May and his men of Company I, 23rd Regiment of Connecticut Volunteers, were captured in Louisiana in June of 1863. They were taken to Camp Ford, which at the time had only about 72 men who were considered, quote, permanent prisoners. So the camp remained a small population for a few months, but then more and more prisoners of war were sent. By the end of 1863, there were hundreds more, and by the summer of 1864, the number of men had risen to nearly 5,000. In fact, Camp Ford became the largest Confederate POW camp or prison pen west of the Mississippi, and it took on the nickname Ford City because of its size. So where was this camp? It was in Tyler, Texas, which is about halfway between Dallas, Texas, and Shreveport, Louisiana. So now let's take a look at this treasure. I'm sure you have never seen anything like this before. This is a handwritten newspaper. Everything you see on the paper was done with a steel pen dipped in ink. And it is so neat and precise, and the lettering is so fine and tiny, you would almost swear that it came off a printing press. It's just kind of unbelievable that this was done by hand and in a prison camp. The newspaper was made from a single sheet of paper folded in half to create 4 panels, 2 on each side. And so it's kind of like a miniaturized newspaper format. The print is extremely tiny, in part because Captain May wanted to get as much as possible on this single sheet of paper. They just couldn't get hold of paper in the camp. And so Captain May was actually only able to do 2 other issues besides this one. As you can see, this paper has writing and it has some illustrations, which are on both sides. And somebody decided to frame it sandwiched between glass, 2 pieces of glass, so that it's possible to see both sides. I'm not sure that that was the best thing for this in the long run, although, of course, the intention was good to keep the fragile paper intact, and preserve it from handling. I'm afraid taking apart it now, it could be dangerous with all these little fragments in it. But anyway, we see that, let me turn it back again. We see the masthead here, which tells us that the title is The Old Flag. And we have the date, which is March 13th, 1864, and it was done at Camp Ford in Texas. It turns out this was the last of the 3 precious issues produced by Captain May. The first was published on February 17th, the second on March 1st, and the third March 13th, so each one was 12 days apart. Now, Captain May's goal for this paper was to help alleviate the extreme boredom in the camp. And he thought this would be a good way to cheer up the men and have some of them participate by, writing stories as well. I believe it was probably just circulated among the men in his mess, or the original 72 held there, not the entire camp, which at the time this was done would have been in the thousands. There's one story on the front page which has chapters of a novel with the subtitle, A Tale of the Mysteries and Miseries of Ford City, Texas. The editor even jokingly offered extraordinary prize money, $5,000, to be paid in Confederate bills. So the Old Flag was quite humorous in ways that would really mean something to the men, and much of it is really written in a tongue-in-cheek kind of style. Another story tells us that they organized some events for themselves, a little bit silly, but certainly very meaningful to keep their spirits listed. And I'll point to this one called a grand masquerade and fancy dress ball. Now, how do you do that in a prison camp? But their idea was to commemorate George Washington's birthday, and I just don't know how they quite interpreted a fancy dress ball in the prison camp, but it obviously made, for a sort of fun and conversation and a story in this newspaper. This newspaper wasn't intended to pass, Union Army secrets, but just the fact that a paper was being circulated would have landed the men in hot water. So all of this was, done on the sly. The paper did include some credible rumors, however. So, for instance, it reported that a recent rumor was that prisoners who had been serving on gunboats would not be eligible for exchange until the North ended the blockade. Well, there was nothing cushy about Camp Ford, of course. The conditions were not great, but they weren't as horrific as the infamous or notorious Andersonville prison. But the men did suffer a great deal from bitter cold, and the rank and file men were clothed, in rags and had no boots. There was very little variety in food. They lived on cornbread or corn pudding and beef that was cooked like shoe leather. Coffee was made of burnt rye. So life was hard and certainly very tedious in these conditions. And in general, depression and sort of the dreary sense of dependence upon one's captors, as it was described, robbed the majority of the men the will or interest in improving things, and most of them were just idle. Apparently, only about 1 in 10 was engaged in activities. Well, despite this, some of the men were actually able to establish their own little economy. And when they could get wood, they would make things and stay busy. Some of them were skilled in carving and woodworking, and so they would make chess figures, chess sets, and tobacco pipes, which they would barter or trade for. And they even produced small pieces of furniture. So we learned that from this newspaper. A short column of statistics tells us that in the last 6 months from the date of this newspaper, 40 sets of chessmen had been carved, the best of them by Lieutenant John Woodward, and that not less than 500 pipes, tobacco pipes of wood and clay had been made. And as far as making furniture, it was noted with pride that Yankee ingenuity had enabled the men to contrive some sort of lathe to do wood turning. And so then they fashioned the furniture by using vines to bind the pieces together. I'm sure you're wondering how on earth this newspaper survived, and I will return to that in a minute. But I also wanted to show you a couple of other Civil War items that we have in the collection. One of them is a carved tobacco pipe, perhaps very much like the ones that were made by men imprisoned at Camp Ford. It's really a great piece, and it's a personal one because it represents the particular battles that the soldier fought in. Now, we don't know whether this was made by the soldier or perhaps something that one of the men in his company made and sold, earned some money that way. But we do know that this piece belonged to a Thomas Livingston Bartholomew, who served in the 9th New York Volunteers, a regiment that was also known as Hawkins Zouaves. He was a native New Yorker, but he ended up in Bridgeport after his service in the Civil War. Just as an addition to that pipe, I wanted to show you a painting you might have seen in books or something. It's a detail from Winslow Homer's painting of Civil War soldiers, Zouaves, and one of them is carving a pipe here. So that little detail is a nice visualization of how a pipe like this was made. So that brings me to this uniform, which belonged to the same soldier I just mentioned, Thomas Bartholomew. We don't have his complete uniform. We don't have the trousers. But we do have several components: the jacket, the vest, a forage cap, and a long sash, which would have been wrapped around the waist a couple of times. The jacket, as you can see, is navy blue wool, and it features a very striking design in red braid. If you aren't familiar with the original Zouaves, they were a light infantry regiment of the French army, highly decorated soldiers and linked to the famously fierce Algerian fighters in North Africa. Their uniforms consisted of short jackets, open at the front, very baggy trousers, which were sort of held in at the ankles by gaiters that were worn over their boots, and a sash wrapped around the waist. And their headgear was a fez type of hat with a tassel on it. So their appearance was very striking, and Europeans and Americans kind of wanted to imitate that look, in part because of the reputation of these fierce fighters. During the Civil War, there were both northern and southern units of Zouaves, and their uniforms varied regiment to regiment, sort of imitating the original Zouave uniforms. For instance, some wore these very baggy pants like the original Zouaves. Others just wore sort of loose trousers. And as we see here, the men in Hawkins Zouaves were not wearing the fez with the tassel. They had a forage cap instead. So to get back to our newspaper, the last issue was created in March of 1864, and it was at the end of June when Captain May was released in exchange for a Confederate soldier. So he took those 3 newspapers and he folded them up into small rectangles. And he sewed them inside the epaulettes, the shoulder straps of his uniform. So they were hidden and preserved that way. When May got back to Bridgeport after the war ended in 1865, the men in his company asked to have copies of those newspapers because it had meant so much to them. I guess he had a good time reading those and making up the stories. And May had had a little bit of newspaper experience before the war. When he returned, he decided that was the occupation he would pursue. And so being in that business, he was able to have lithograph prints made of, these copies made of the original papers. Now, I believe that aside from this original we have, the only ones still in existence are copies. So that makes this pretty darn special. After May died in 1910, 3 of his comrades decided to publish a book about their captain and his prison newspaper. You can see here it's called The Old Flag. And it contains a lot of the history and includes illustrations of those copies, so you can actually, read the paper, all 3 issues. And if you live in the Bridgeport area and are interested in reading this book, you can go to the Bridgeport History Center at the public library downtown, and they have copies of it there. I'm not sure what other libraries have it, but you might well find it in several other Connecticut library locations. And if you want to read some of Captain May's letters written while he was imprisoned, you can find about 24 of them on the Library of Virginia's website, virginiamemory.com. These letters were digitized as part of the James I. Robertson Jr. Civil War Sesquicentennial Legacy Collection. Quite a mouthful there. Captain May was really one of those exceptional people whose spirit stayed strong despite the circumstances of the prison camp. And by nature, he seemed to have had a very optimistic outlook. He was both a natural leader and a man of many talents, not only a skilled draftsman and writer, but also entertaining the men by playing the violin, which his men had pooled their meager resources in camp to buy for him. And so, of course, he wanted to bring that violin home. He had to get a special pass to do that. The violin, of course, in its case, and he managed to hide some things inside the violin. I'm not sure exactly what, but I think that's a great story, along with hiding the newspapers in his epaulettes. I hope you've enjoyed seeing this rare handwritten newspaper and learning the story, as well as seeing a few of our other Civil War artifacts. I do look forward to seeing you next time for another episode of Curious People Wanted. So in the meantime, stay curious, and I'll see you then.